I'll often just go into executive meetings and go, it all comes down to you can't really count stuff. You have to count what you bought and count what you're using, stay in compliance, and with technology, as we all know, think how much it's changed just in our lifetimes.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we speak with Diane Carco, president of Swingtide. And Garry, I know that you are, close friends with Diane. I'm not even really sure, but you know her well. You brought her on for her first episode, and I can tell you that this is a great interview, and we are certainly going to be having her come back. But this mysterious world of cyber insurance, and really just in this whole contracting space, so much has changed. Diane's going to tell us about her history going back to the 90s in contracting with cyber insurance and really around IT contracting. But so many things have changed in those years and the pace of technology. And I think we finally hit this point where we're not even sure what's coming next because it's going so fast. And Diane's going to give us some insight into that and some tips about how to navigate through that as we move forward into the future.
Yeah, for sure. And Diane is a definite SME. We use that pretty loosely sometimes, but she is definitely a subject matter expert in what she's done, and her tenure of knowledge has really been applicable in the healthcare arena. But just her lessons learned to get her where she's at, the humbleness she brings to this is pretty amazing. She has an amazing team she talks about as well, and just how really IT needs to be integrated within the supply chain network within the hospital area is not only getting, and they're already at the table now, but it's only going to keep moving in that direction as we move more and more to the network, more to these web-based applications that we need to use. So looking forward to what Diane has to offer, and her definitely subject matter expert. So good to have her on.
All right. We're going to be right back after a short break with Diane Carco, president of Swingtide.
I'm Hayes Waldrop.
This is Garry Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Diane Carco, president of Swingtide. And Diane, we're excited. We've done a lot of interviews around IT and IT sourcing and contracting and considerations. But I got to tell you, this whole cyber challenges out there is one of the primary topics that's really been going on in the supply chain industry lately. And so we're excited to continue the discussion with you today. And I know we're going to be focusing a lot on cyber insurance, something that we haven't talked about yet. And I definitely want to dive into this because I've got another company that's in the IT space, and I've started to see 10 million in aggregate showing up all of a sudden. So getting really excited to converse with you about this. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's truly my pleasure. I am excited to talk to you guys. And as hard as it is to believe, talking about IT contracting and cyber insurance, it's something I like to do.
Well, it puts you in an area of need for sure. Why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself? And it doesn't have to just be professional. If you've got something you want to share that you love to do in your free time, we'd love to hear that too.
Well, I don't want to take too much time. As Garry knows, I'm from Wisconsin. I'm a Green Bay Packers sports
Oh,
fanatic.
this was going great up until then, Diane.
And you know, as proud as I am to own Swingtide, I am also a Green Bay Packers shareholder. So
There you
that
go.
share of stock has more prominence in my office than any of the others.
I love Aaron Rodgers. Love Aaron
Yeah.
Rodgers.
Yeah, he played great last
I
weekend.
used to love Aaron Rodgers. That's a long story. So, being from Wisconsin, I was born and raised there, lived with the cold. I live in Henderson, Nevada now. Happy to report the weather is perfect and the airport is convenient. I am a CPA and have an accounting degree from Marquette University. Interestingly, it took me on a bizarre journey, the typical public accounting, but then I got into mergers and acquisitions. This is not to date myself, but back in the late 80s, early 90s, and had an opportunity to learn how important technology relationships, this was in financial services predominantly, were to the way banks were operating at the time. And in my 20s, had an interesting experience to be involved in the first litigation on software terms. Well, I was fascinated by it. I, through that, actually got responsibility for IT organizations, and lo and behold, here I was, merger and acquisition knowledge, became the CIO of a big insurance company that was acquiring a lot of entities, and had this tremendous financial and contracting and things contract can do experience. Well, it was a really interesting world then. The distributed computing was coming up, the internet. I know a lot of your young listeners probably can't even envision a time before it, but this is just the 90s I'm talking about. A good friend of mine who's a lawyer, and I thought, you know, technology vendors are really powerful, and customers don't really have the knowledge they need to have as technology vendors get more and more important to operations. So, kind of as a fluke, we wrote a book called The Smart Way to Buy Information Technology. It bizarrely is still referenced and was just recently published in Chinese. So it's not in current print, and I think you can probably scoop up a copy on Amazon used for about $1. But a lot of the principles are the foundation of what we built Swingtide's operations on.
So you talked about, you know, back in the 90s doing a software agreement. And, you know, we hear lots of things thrown around, like when you're on the website, there's like T's and C's, and then we have service level agreements that get written into these. How basic was the contracting structure when you first got started, and what did you see change, you know, over the years leading up until now?
Well, interestingly, early technology agreements with the IBMs and Computer Associates of the world that were geared more to mainframe operations were very one-sided towards the vendor and really restrictive to the customer, but the customer could manage it when everything was in a glass room data center. Things started to get really complex from there with services when outsourcing became on the rise, and a lot of organizations couldn't build up a technology operation and opted to buy it instead. So the most complex early agreements were the comprehensive technology outsourcing agreements that involved detailed descriptions of services, consumption-based charging metrics, SLAs, detail on who had to buy an asset, refresh an asset, what you do with the people, etc. So personally, and a lot of my team cut their teeth on doing these complex outsourcing agreements. And bizarrely, one went bad that we had to terminate, and then we brought everything back in-house, and that's when I became the CIO of the big insurance company. So I have learned how to do things right from having dealt with things that went just horribly wrong. And Swingtide, I'll just give you 30 seconds on that. We help our clients with sourcing, contracting, and vendor management, mostly IT, but so many things are blurring outside of IT. We get involved, particularly in healthcare, which is most of our business, in anything that connects to the network, which could be a bedpan, right? As we all know. So, but a lot of my core team at Swingtide, we're only about 40 people, but the core of us have been together since the mid-90s at a lot of different places and shared just amazing, complex experiences that really let us take a lot of lessons learned to our current clients.
I feel like SAS and HIPAA had some of the biggest impacts on contracting in this space. I kind of want to know if you would validate that, but what I really want to know is, are there some other things that happened in the industry or as technology developed that had an equal impact on contracting considerations in IT?
SAS and HIPAA, completely agree with you, hugely impacting to the complexity of the way a customer has to interface with its vendor. Data sharing is certainly up there. With HIPAA, we have PHI, and then there's PII, but any data sharing at all, particularly now that data is often deemed to be the most important asset of an organization, protecting that and the complexities of protecting it with all of the different third parties that touch data or can access data has really made things increasingly complex in the last 5 years. If I go longer ago, SAS almost made things a little bit easier because you were able to buy effectively hosting your data center services and the application and enter into those relationships in a way where you could define a user and you could use what you needed and didn't have a lot of access. There's still a preponderance of legacy relationships, really in every organization across all industries, that present different challenges that a lot of the current people don't think about because they're more used to a SaaS world. So we have, at any point in time, too many clients in the middle of software audits because there was complexity in the way someone may have licensed or obtained usage rights from a vendor. And they, say they rolled it out, but then virtualized their servers, not to get into the techie weeds, but they didn't license it for virtualization. They rolled it out for virtualization. And there's a lot of bad actors in the technology space coming after those types of companies to pay compliance penalties. So at the highest level from a technology contracting perspective, really understanding the way you bought something. And right now, services is hard because you have to define it and have SLAs and have acceptance. But I think people are more comfortable with that. Software is really hard. It continues to be hard because the way a vendor may write the way you have usage might not be well understood by your technical folks that have to actually monitor it. And solid vendor management in these complex technology agreements is rare. So, it's simple. Know what you need, write down exactly what you need, be able to count stuff, right? That's what I'll often just go into executive meetings and go, it all comes down to you can't really count stuff. You have to count what you bought and count what you're using, stay in compliance, and with technology, as we all know, think how much it's changed just in our lifetimes.
Huge.
Technology evolution provisions. It's one of the most complicated things people have to add into agreements. And it has
because you're like trying to look into a crystal ball.
Always have to, you know what? I 1 year almost gave all my clients crystal balls because that's what you have to have. Because with a technology agreement, and I know you guys talk a lot about supply chain agreements, one of the big differences, and it took me a while to figure out the differences, in a technology agreement, you're making a multi-year commitment, and you're investing tremendous amount of money in implementing something or loading it or training people how to use it. You're kind of married to this vendor. So if you don't anticipate or dust off your crystal ball in such a way that you can anticipate the way security threats are going to change, usage is going to change, your organization may acquire somebody, divest somebody. You have to have all these evolutionary provisions in it, not just on technology, but your strategic changes. And if you don't,
you've lost your flexibility.
And Diane, that's where I wanted to take you next too. Is you brought up supply chain, and you being the SME, as we call it, the subject matter expert. Not only do you see it in pharmaceuticals, and you see it in lab, and you see it down the road in surgery with a new robot that comes in. But when we talk about supply chain consulting with IT and how that relationship mirrors and blends, I'd like you to take that in that next step, because you talked about SLAs, Justin brought up SAS and HIPAA. I mean, it touches the whole avenue within the hospital entity, from executive level down to who's doing the audit. So that relationship with supply chain and the contracting piece, how do we be successful? How do you get down that road to keep moving it as it evolves on a 60-month term contract, as you said, as it evolves and changes?
It's really been fascinating for me, because I'm going to take a quick step back so you know perspective. I knew insurance, I knew manufacturing. I didn't know anything about healthcare till about 12 years ago, and had just the best opportunity. I do a lot of expert work in technology litigations. So had an opportunity to work with a really big health system where I got to meet my friend Garry here and saw the change in what technology meant to healthcare providers, predominantly going from, you'd hear the doctor's gripe, I have to have an electronic health record, all the way to now where everything is dependent on technology. And the fascinating thing was, the technology staff wasn't used to complex enterprise technology challenges that people in other industries were used to. Because, in healthcare many, many years ago, you had to, you had PCs, you had revenue cycle interfaces, you had things like that, but it's not what it is today. And I've just never seen in any industry the growth of the mission critical nature of a function. So I think it caught everybody by surprise. At Swingtide, we have a number of us were CIOs, and Mark Barner was the CIO of Ascension Health for 10 years, and he really saw it all. So he and I have a lot of really interesting conversations about how technology changed in healthcare. And naturally, I think the industry was caught a little flat-footed. So you had, all the challenges that have always existed in supply chain associated with physician preference items, or how you have the right thing in the right place all the time, which you guys know so much more about than I do. But when everything started connecting to a network and hooked into a nurse call system and required certain levels of security, and all of a sudden everybody wanted a network, and you didn't have LAN ports or anything that actually connected hospitals, and you're in the basement of the sub-basement of the sub-basement and expect somebody to use their cell phone, I still think very much immature. I think we have tons of opportunity still to integrate it. But how do we integrate it, Garry, I think was your question. And what are the differences? Fundamentally, as I work with a lot of our clients, interestingly, I would say half the time our healthcare providers, the supply chain team hires us, and half the time the CIO hires us. And it's been kind of an interesting dynamic on who owns IT contracting and what's IT and where do you draw the line, because there's almost no line anymore.
It's like this.
Yeah. This takes us to the insurance piece, I think, really well, because you were talking about the crystal ball, looking for the future, multi-year agreements. And, I also feel like they just kind of slap this large insurance policy on their contract templates, whether it applies to the particular vendor that they're partnering with or not. And it's kind of on the vendor to say, hey, wait a second, due to the nature of our solution, this is excessive. But what I really want to get at is the why for this coverage. And I think everybody will kind of look at it and say, well, they need this coverage because if they get sued for not protecting the PHI or even the PII in some cases, that they want to know that they're not, as a hospital system, going to get hit really hard on it. That all makes sense to me. But I think there might be another reason for it. And I think that reason might be that if you're in this multi-year agreement and that blended nature that you just described, like where's the line, who owns the data, it's so integrated with what we do every day, that what a hospital system really doesn't want, even more than not being fully covered if they're sued, is a lawsuit of this partner that's so embedded in their day-to-day, causing the business to go under. And what that does logistically for that health system to all of a sudden have to move something in when a company is going essentially bankrupt from a lawsuit. Am I right about that? And are there other reasons for the insurance?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. Let me try and parse insurance in a couple different buckets because it's really hard for people to think about. As I said, I used to be the CIO at a carrier. I ran global IT ops for the largest insurance broker in the world. And when we contracted with vendors, we required them to have insurance. I got that because that was the business we sold, right? So I supported it. Well, my team and I have probably negotiated. We were all like trying to kick this around because we have a tool that has a lot of this in. But if we go back even to the early days, probably over 50,000 contracts for clients. Never once have I seen the insurance provision triggered. Not even in the litigation situations that I use. So there's a requirement for certain insurance within a vendor contract. And, I think, Justin, the point you were making is right. If you do a vendor review, right, which is another kind of important thing and more important as we have this grand proliferation of new vendors entering the market with new offerings, vendors that don't have a lot of history and you're acquiring a product or a service from them that really could have a significant impact on your business, you want them to have some type of an insurance policy in case they go out of business for you to be compensated for whatever you expected them to do. So that's your just more traditional commercial insurance you expect from a vendor. You're also requiring them to have some type of cyber insurance. And certainly if it's even a big player like Azure or an Amazon that you might be using for a data center, you want them to have some type of insurance against some type of a breach that they may have to pay for you. But the insurance that I worry more about is the cyber insurance policies that the clients are entering into. And this is where these two things
not what they expect contractually, but what they're actually doing to protect their health systems.
So forget what you require from a vendor, right? There are absolutely insurances you need to require from a vendor. Think of it when you do a vendor risk assessment. Say you enter into a deal with Apple or Microsoft, you don't need them to have insurance, right? They have more cash than they know what to do with. Small vendors in your vendor risk assessment, you probably want to have insurance depending on what they do for you. That's kind of the more traditional everybody's used to. Well, now your company, whether it's a healthcare provider or anybody else, cyber insurance is probably becoming your most expensive insurance. And you're getting cyber insurance because you're afraid you're going to have a ransomware attack, or you're going to have some other type of common cyber threat that's going to come after your company data or more importantly, your customer data or your patient's data. Now, cyber insurance carriers all lost money last year. Now, and having come from insurance, they're really good at making money. All the cyber insurance carriers lost money last year. And insurance carriers, that just never happens. And from an insurance carrier perspective, they write a policy, and if anybody's ever tried to read a policy, it's almost unreadable. There's lots of different things, even on your personal home or auto, there's lots of different things that could make a claim you would have not be paid. That's kind of the insurance practice. They write a policy, sometimes you get paid, sometimes you don't. Well, a very interesting and unique dynamic is occurring with cyber insurance now, as everybody has to have it. But insurance carriers are denying claims not as much from what's in your policy, but what's in your application. And this is the scary part. So when I talk about how, over the last few years, and I'll stay in healthcare for a minute, supply chain and IT have to be hand in glove, right? They just have to work together. There's new things. Well, risk management now has to come into that party because they're the ones entering into the cyber insurance policies. And if I don't know if you've looked at a cyber insurance application recently, but I had a friend of mine actually pull cyber insurance applications from the 12 largest carriers in the world because I'm so curious as to what they're asking and what they could use to disallow a claim. Well, the most important question on there, and this affects all of us in the supply chain world, is who are your vendors? And who are your vendors that are entering into your network in some form or fashion? Who are your vendors that you're sharing data with? And I've talked to some of the carriers that are putting these applications together. I said, well, okay, you're getting answers. How are you making sure those are the right answers? Well, this gets into the risk because I don't know about you guys, but it's really, if you go into any organization and you say, give me a list of all your vendors and tell me exactly what they do, it's hard to do. It's hard to have that list of vendors to know what they connect to the network. And as these cyber insurance applications mature, so right now, who are your third parties? Well, let's say you missed one. Or let's say you missed a subcontractor to a service provider, and that's where the breach was. Well, this is where your risk is, that you could get a ransomware attack that came in through that way, and your claim might be denied. So what's the moral of this story? The importance of, as I said before, it was counting things. It's knowing who your third parties are and exactly what they do. We also have to really start, let's get ahead of the insurance carriers. I don't know if if you ever know what a SOC 2 Type 2 certification is, right? It used to be a SAS 70 for those back in the day. There are security certifications on data centers. If you put PHI or PII in a data center, probably should make sure there's a special security certification. You have to review the audit. You have to make sure it's current. And every year you're working with them, you better keep that up to date. That's traditional vendor management that also people don't always do. But a friend of mine is the chairman of the board of a big health system in St. Louis. And he just became chairman, and he asked me, Diane, what should I ask, the executives when they come in? And we talked about how cyber attacks is really scary and introduces personal liability to board members and executives, et cetera. And people spend millions of dollars on tools that are cyber tools. And I boiled it down for him and I said, bring your CIO in, bring your head of supply chain in, bring them together and ask them to hand you a list of all their vendors that connect to the network. And if they can't, that's where you want to start fixing.
That's really, really good, Diane. And there's two things I want to bring up here. With that being said, there's two things that we do not have anything in common. I'm not a Packers fan. That's number one. Number two, in my entire life, I've never read a software license agreement. So there's two things that we have in difference here. But the nugget, I think that you said right there, for any, if we've got a supply chain exec out there or even an IT person that's listening to this, is they've got to do a really good job, sounds like, of categorizing and knowing everybody that's touching that network, even a little, leaving a lot, correct?
Absolutely. Aside from the fact that we're going to have to get together and talk to Packers, and I'll walk you through a software agreement sometime.
I'm honestly not really interested.
So, don't they? It's really the fundamental. Here, I want to come back to football. It's the blocking and tackling, right? If you listen to Vince Lombardi, he's another little profile
I've heard of him.
Together. All blocking and tackling. You have to know who your third parties are, build in the right protections, know exactly what they're doing for you, know how you're using them, know if they're doing what they're supposed to, and you're going to be in a much better place for the really complex things. So if you can't get that basic blocking and tackling down, it should really be your focus. It's funny because with a lot of our clients, we're fortunate that clients bring us in like to do a big complex negotiation. Like if they say, oh, it's Microsoft, can you just do this? We do that. But then we have a lot of clients that actually outsource their whole sourcing, contracting, and vendor management function to us. And we had to build a tool to help us answer those fundamental blocking and tackling questions. So it's hard. It's hard. It's not intuitive. There's not a lot of stuff out there. You can't do anything without knowing
Gotcha.
that.
All right. So real quick, because we're right at the end of the time, and I want to get this out there because you alluded to it, but you didn't tell us why, and I'm so curious.
She left the Tennessee Titans. That's what you're trying to say.
No, the New England Patriots. Come on now. Mac Jones, baby. So I just, the question is, you said the cyber insurance carriers were losing money. And I know you told us that they were denying claims due to the application. But what I really want to know is, why were they losing money? Was it because of an increase in claims, or did they just not project, correctly, and they weren't selling enough because hospitals couldn't afford it? Like, what was the dynamic there?
That is such a good question. And I asked two of them that exact question because I was so curious too. And they basically said, we anticipated an average ransomware cost to be $35,000 an event, and it turned out to be over $250,000 an event.
Wow.
So when you're off almost 10 times one of your core assumptions, that's why they lost money.
So they are also, just to tie this up in a bow, looking into the crystal ball themselves, and it's catching everybody off guard.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter what side of the table you're on. Nobody knows what's coming next.
You couldn't have said it better.
Wow. Diane, by the way, we have a little battle that goes on in the background on the show about who asked the best questions. And I think that was a mic drop for me, so thank you for giving me the winner chicken dinner on this podcast before we wrap.
He deserves one.
You did a phenomenal job. Yeah, I've lost every episode up until today, so I'm taking this one. Really great job, and very unique conversation. Like I said, we've had a lot of cybersecurity type conversations, but this was just so different than any of the other ones that we had. And we really covered so many different angles from various perspectives on the issue as well. I definitely have a lot more knowledge, but I also know that this is one of those things where people have to continue to get information to stay ahead of the game. And so, who they partner with and who they, source that information from is going to be critically important, I can only imagine.
Well, thank you so much. This was so much fun. Thank you guys for inviting me.
That was Diane Carco, president of Swingtide. And we talked a lot about cyber insurance and really just the pace of play when it comes to contracting in IT. And I think coming into the interview, I was really thinking a lot more along the lines of cyber insurance requirements for vendors or of vendor partners as you do contracting. But then we got into a little detail around contracting with the actual insurance provider for your healthcare insurance for your hospital or your system, and really what that looks like. And interestingly, Garry, the fact that these companies lost money last year really speaks so much to the point where she was making that we don't really know what's coming in the future. And that presents challenges to everybody, no matter what perspective they have. And if you start wondering why your rates are going up, it's because things are changing very fast. And when these lawsuits come in and this litigation, that's what's going to drive the cost of the insurance premiums.
Absolutely. And just the miss she talks about in her interview, like 9 to 10 fold of a miss on what some of these penalties were placed upon. But just understanding her perspective on what vendors you're using, what applications are truly being applicable within the healthcare arena, I think are avenues we need to continue to consider and be just a reality check of what's coming, and probably at a rate that we're not even ready for. So it was great to have Diane on today. I know Hayes, Justin, and myself were very impressed with the detail of information she had, and just look forward to maybe having her back again. So once again, I thought the podcast today was really, really amazing to pull in supply chain with IT, and the level of detail was truly there. So just a great podcast today.
That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Power Supply by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or search for Power Supply on your favorite podcast application. We've also got bonus content for certain episodes. You just got to download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.